As Dr. Huff has set the stage about talking about the supply chain aspects and gave a wonderful overview on DOE vision, plans, and actions, we can now move to talk about what the future of nuclear power looks like. We have Mr. Edward Key to talk about the future of nuclear power. Mr. Key is the CEO, founder, principal consultant at the Nuclear Economics Consulting Group and is an expert on nuclear economics. He provides strategic economic advice to companies, governments on nuclear power and electricity industry issues. Mr. Key was appointed to the US DOE Nuclear Energy Advisory Committee in February 2022. For the complete bio, I refer you to the website. I will also be posting it on the chat. Mr. Key, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rama. First of all, thank you for the introduction. Thank you, Donna and Bud and Jean for having me be a part of this panel. It's a wonderful opportunity. Very honored to be here. Following Dr. Huff is always a tough thing to do. She's such a great speaker. I'm going to move pretty quickly through my slides once I get them loaded up here. And I may have time for questions. If I don't have time to answer questions this morning, I'm planning on joining the session starting at 2 o'clock this afternoon. We can answer them then. So I think that's, go on to the next slide and the next slide. So here's what I'm going to talk about today. Three points. I'm going to cover the first two pretty quickly. Basically, you've heard this message already from other people. We need more power from nuclear power to help reduce sector emissions for electricity sector. But the U.S. nuclear power is declining. I'm impressed by Dr. Huff's optimism, but we've got some issues to deal with. We're having declining nuclear power, in my view, because we've got market-based nuclear power operating in markets that have low commodity electricity prices. We need to address that issue, and addressing that issue is going to require a greater role of government. Next slide. So I think everyone's going to agree that climate change is a human problem. That debate's over. Next slide. And a big part of that is electricity. And as we move transportation into electric vehicles, it's going to be even more electricity. Electricity is a very good target, frankly, because there are big companies, there are big power plants, as opposed to trying to go after millions and millions of vehicles. Next slide. Nuclear electricity can help, and we've seen this from a couple of different people. Nuclear's got low emissions. It's also reliable, it's dispatchable, it's clean, it's scalable, which is important. But next slide. We need a whole lot of it to meet some of these climate goals. The IPCC 1.5 degrees centigrade pathways include on average over 1,000 gigawatts of global nuclear capacity by 2050. It's about 3 times what we have today. The Biden targets of a carbon-free power sector by 2035 may mean replacing more than 700 gigawatts of fossil fuel generation in this country. That's a lot of nuclear. We should have started already, but we could do that. Projections, though, aren't that promising. Next slide. So the world projections, even the most optimistic ones from the recent IAEA RDS1 document, don't get to the level we need. And I'd encourage you to take a look at those, because some of those projections basically are how the Chinese nuclear build is going to offset the decline in nuclear in the US and Europe. Next slide. The U.S. nuclear capacity, and this is from the Energy Information Administration Annual Energy Outlook 2022, basically has nuclear capacity declining to 2050, not increasing. The reference case looks worse than today. Some of the other cases, like the high oil and gas supply, are even lower. I'll go back to this on a later point. Next slide. So why is nuclear power declining? We've got a market-based nuclear power industry. There are market-based customers making investment decisions. There are market-based vendors selling into that market. In some cases, they're selling their power into wholesale electricity markets. and there were a number of political and legal and economic actions that we took as a country that led to this. I'm going to discuss four. Next click. So I usually talk about the last three on this boat chart, but I put the Federalist form of government in just so the GW law, constitutional law folks will have something to chew on later. Next slide. So federalism. I'm not suggesting that the framers of the Constitution should have been thinking about electricity or nuclear power, but the sharing of power between states and federal government in this country have led to this big disconnect in electricity. We've got states that have a lot of control, even in market states. We've got a number of cases about federalism and nuclear power. The unitary form of government in some other countries that have nuclear power, like France, the UK, and China, have avoided some of these problems. Next slide. The next thing is our focus in the US on investor-owned utilities. We started out, the tech bros in the late 1800s were basically selling electric lighting to companies in cities. They're running wires down the streets. The cities didn't want multiple sets of wires on their streets. They had franchise agreements. The franchise agreements morphed into state utility regulation. By the 20s, most states had some regulated utility approach, basically to have an investor-owned utility that had a traditional model, obligation to serve, cost recovery, monopoly service area, vertical integration. And today we have this pretty well-developed industry. That investor-owned utility approach, along with public power and federal power, channeled an enormous amount of capital into this country to build out our grid. But some other countries did this with government utilities, did it differently. And Nebraska, in fact, doesn't have any IOUs. Next slide. Just a quick review of what this model looks like. The credit source and the investable issues come through the regulator, the rate-making process, and the captive monopoly customers. Without those, you don't have much of an investor interest. Investors get returns through that process. Next slide. The next thing we did is we decided to have market or private nuclear power. Dr. Huff talked about the Manhattan Project, and that was an amazing, fast effort. That led to the Atomic Energy Act of 1946. We kind of forget this one because it was the first one. It essentially put nuclear power under government control under the Atomic Energy Commission. But guess who? The investor-owned utilities said, we want to roll in this. There was a big debate, a year of debate in Congress that led to this Atomic Energy Act of 1954, which replaced the earlier act. And it created a very clear role for private companies, for investor-owned utilities, and private vendors in a market-based nuclear power approach. So we now, in this country, have private owners of nuclear power, private companies. We have private companies who build them. That's different from some other countries where the entire enterprise, owning plants, building them, the entire nuclear energy industrial structure is owned by the government. That led to a massive US bill, but it had problems. Only about a third of the plants we planned to build in the beginning of this program got built. There were cost overruns, there were delays, there were disallowances for shareholders. They had one-off plants, and multiple vendors rather than having some standard design and fleet build, which I'll talk more about fleet build later. Next slide. So this worked pretty well. As Dr. Huff said, we have the biggest nuclear fleet in the world. But things have kind of stalled out since the 1990s. Those issues I just talked about, disallowances, the cost overruns, delays, economics, cheap gas, that kind of thing, have led to this US nuclear fleet stabilizing. And we've had a lot of closures over time. Some of the more notable ones, TMI-2, we all know about that. Shoreham, we all know about that one. Trojan and Zion were closed because it seemed to be too expensive to replace steam generators. They probably could have done that if nuclear value had been higher. The rest of them, Kewanee on down, closed because they were merchant plants in markets and they were losing money. We'll talk more about that later. Next slide. So the fourth issue we have is electricity market reform. we're sort of following in the UK's footsteps. They did this in about 1990. And the concept is to have wholesale electricity markets with generation competing in those markets. FERC led the US effort, but because of point one, the federalism form of government, some states just said no. So now we have this mix of traditional states and market states. And the nuclear power decline in the US has largely been because of merchant plants and the market states. So other countries didn't do this. Countries without markets, without reform, may have had better success in nuclear power. Next slide. In terms of investable nuclear power, these projects have a very complicated cash flow. First of all, they've got a very long life. In this case, 60 years, maybe longer. They've got a very long and high capital cost period in the beginning. That's a very hard deal to finance in any situation, but when you do it under a private vendor, next slide. The problem with doing privately owned nuclear power projects is that any kind of commercial discount rate will give you a net present value that says cash flows after about year 30 aren't worth anything. And so now you've got this project that's the stub in the beginning, dominated by the initial capital outlay, and in an environment where many examples around in the industry around the world of projects that have been built that took longer, that cost more, pretty daunting deal to pay for all of that in 20 years or less of commercial operation with unreliable, unpredictable market prices for electricity. So it's a pretty tough thing for private merchant plants, but even hard for investor-owned utilities. Next slide. Those of you who follow this industry know that there have been a lot of closures, and I listed those earlier. So we go through the list here, all these plants: Kewaunee, Vermont Yankee, Fort Calhoun, Pilgrim, Arnold, Palisades is going to close in a couple of weeks. They closed because they were in markets, wholesale electricity markets, and they couldn't cover their fixed operating costs. There wasn't any option for the owners except to close these plants to fix that financial loss problem. Next slide. There were other plants that closed that were caused by high costs of major maintenance. I mentioned Zion and Trojan earlier. Crystal River 3 and San Onofre had issues. If the value of nuclear electricity had been higher, you might have justified taking the actions to fix those problems. And then you have these other plants closing because of political and environmental issues. To some extent, if the value of nuclear electricity were high, some of those issues could have been resolved. Diablo Canyon clearly hasn't closed yet. Looks like they probably will be. One of the issues is the cost and the risk of closing down their direct cooling and building cooling towers. Don't know how that's going to get resolved if they do decide to move forward, but they look like they probably won't. Next slide. There also is some positive news here. There's a lot more merchant plants that would have closed early but didn't because of zero emission credits payments. These are state government actions to save plants from closing early, basically compensating the plants for positive externalities because the commodity electricity prices don't reflect the value of clean electricity. And importantly, and this goes back to my first point about federalism, these state ZEC programs pass the cost of these ZECs onto state-regulated retail electricity customers. It'd be hard for the federal government to have a ZEC program without also having, in this country at least, the states signed on to that. And essentially, the ZECs are similar to the out-of-market incentives that renewable energy credits and state mandates present. Next slide. So just a few quotes here. I'm not going to read through these, but a lot of people are recognizing that we need more capacity. We need more nuclear power. We ought to double it. We need colossal new investments. And the future looks pretty dire for nuclear power. Next slide. So in my view, the future of nuclear power depends on addressing this thing I call market failure. The market failure is that the US has great conditions for new nuclear power. We have a large need for capacity, especially if we start closing fossil units down. We have a proven nuclear regulatory regime, long and positive experience, established vendors, established operators. But market investment in nuclear power is just not likely unless something changes because the market value of nuclear is low. This is market failure, and government has a role to fix that. Next slide. There's encouraging new support for nuclear power. I mentioned the ZEC program. So 2016 to 2019, there were several programs, plus the Connecticut Clean Energy contracts that saved Millstone. The new 2021 ZEC program in Illinois saved a couple other plants. The Build Back Better Act, if we can use that term, included a production tax credit. That didn't get passed, but there's talks around about passing a new smaller bill that maybe had these production tax credits for existing nuclear in them. We'll see how that goes. What did pass was the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act that was signed into law last year, and it created this new $6 billion civil nuclear credit program now being implemented by DOE. All these are very positive signs that government's taking a role to help nuclear, but they're all focused on existing nuclear, not at new. So I've got three scenarios for future of U.S. nuclear power. Next slide. The first one I call business as usual. It's kind of where we are today. No major changes in federal policy. And essentially, as the EIA chart showed, nuclear power is going to decline. And basically, the decline is going to be shaped by state ZEC programs, by federal programs that provide more revenue, by license renewal and life extension. But little or no new nuclear power is going to be built. That means that we're going to end up dominating our electricity sector by renewables and natural gas. Next slide. This is kind of what the EIA projections show, and I've got some more detail over on the right-hand side. And what you ought to note there is that the only new reactors in that projection for the reference case is Vogtle that shows up just after the 2021 line. A lot of closures, and importantly, there's a fairly optimistic assumption here about a lot of nuclear plants operating for 80 years or longer, because if they only operated for 60, a lot of them would be closing at about 2050. So, next slide. The next scenario is what I call new nuclear incentives. It's sort of keeping the existing system, private owners, private investors, private vendors, and putting new incentives into place to convince people to build new nuclear power plants, right? Convincing IOUs and their state regulators, convincing public power, doing even more to convince people to build merchant nuclear. That may do something like the EPACT of 2005, but more, maybe long-term power contracts, maybe some government equity, some government help in covering completion risk. That's the cost overrun potential and delay potential. But it runs into this problem here about revenue and cost recovery. How do you recover contract terms if you don't have customers? It's a problem. Next slide. The UK gives us some lessons for this scenario. The Hinkley Point C project had some incentives based on the UK electricity market reform process, a long-term power contract, but because the UK is a unitary government, they were able to take that contract, put a new counterparty company into place that recovers that then from regulated retail companies or licensed retail companies in the UK. Hard for the US government to do that under our current scheme. A lot of other incentives. And that led to the financial investment decision for Hinkley Point C by these foreign state-owned nuclear utility owners. Another thing we don't really do here, it'd be pretty hard for us to say, let's let CGN or EDF build nuclear power plants in our country. They tried that with Calvert Cliffs, that didn't work. But importantly, in the UK, it wasn't enough for private projects. Horizon and NewGen didn't happen. The next EDF project is Sizewell C, so they're saying the CFD contract approach won't be enough. So now the UK is saying we're going to go to a regulated asset-based approach with some government equity and maybe some coverage of completion risk. We'll see exactly what that looks like. Who knows what comes after this? but it's sort of a project by project thing, not necessarily a fleet build. Next slide. Thank you. So the next scenario that I'm putting forward is a big change. It basically makes nuclear power a critical national infrastructure. It puts the federal government in the role of owning and operating these plants, basically doing a fleet build approach that looks like the French and now the Chinese approach. It's going to require some pretty hard to implement changes to the US system, including how we recover revenue and cost recovery. DOD might be able to do that. Federal, GSA purchasing for federal installations might be able to do that, but it's going to be tough. It's going to require a lot of bipartisan support, pass new laws, improve budgets. There could be a scenario 4. I'm not going to go there, but the scenario 4 might be to really look like France or China, which means we nationalize the nuclear industrial complex. That's a pretty big step that I don't even want to talk about. But next slide. So what does this look like, this scenario 3? A nuclear power strategy that has a fleet build. The fleet build comes up with some standard designs and vendors. And I'm purposely using the plural in that box because maybe more than one's possible given the size of our fleet. That leads to developments in nuclear industrial capacity, learning and scale benefits. That gets nuclear power costs down and risks down that support the strategy. Next slide. Here's how France did it. And I want you to focus on the blue boxes about how many plants they ordered. Imagine if you were able to order, tens or dozens, 1,300 megawatt units ordered in 1976. That's the kind of thing you would need to build a fleet up in the US. Pretty hard to get there from here, but it's possible. So next slide. So the summary, we need more nuclear power, but we're not, right now our fleet's diminishing. It's diminishing because we've got a market-based approach to nuclear power and the US electricity industry. I've got 3 scenarios I presented for differing outcomes, and we need a lot of action to move away from the business as usual scenario, which seems to be the one we're on now. Next slide. I'm done with my slides, but I want to talk about this market failure book that covers some of the issues in my presentation. It's for sale, but this link at the top of the page is for a free PDF version for those of you who decide to join this conference and watch my presentation. Thanks. I'm ready to answer questions now. Let me pull up the Q&A. And by the way, if there are more questions than I can answer today, and there aren't any in the Q&A panel right now, I'll be around for the 2 p.m. discussion session. Thank you.
We welcome any questions. If anyone wants to ask anything orally, just put a Q into the Q&A and I can unmute you. Gosh, it was so clear. That's amazing. Let's give people a moment here. And I think that was a really fantastic presentation. I think you're highlighting a lot of the issues that we're going to have to struggle with, and some of it across the board, I think, with the whole industry. We're seeing a few questions coming in now. Oops, okay.
There was a question from Dan about, is the civil nuclear credit program enough? I can't comment too much on this. I've been advising the US DOE on this program. So whatever I say is going to be my view only, not the department's view, not the government's view. To put this in perspective, the civil nuclear credit program is $6 billion over 4 years. That should be enough to save a few plants. By comparison, the New York State ZEC program, I think, is $7 billion over 12 years. So it saved 4 plants. So it's not a lot, but it's a good start. It could be an interim fix to save some plants until we can get something better and bigger and longer term, like production tax credits.
I wonder, Ed, if we could go back to one of the questions that was posed to Dr. Huff, asking about, what it takes in terms of the supply chain. Where's the sort of, I'm trying to go back and actually see how the question was phrased. But what specifically needs to be done to accelerate the deployment of reactors and its supply chain in a time frame to be relevant to meeting the U.S. climate change goals? I mean, you've hit on a lot of the big economic movers. Anything in particular you'd hone in on that we either in the private sector or in the government sector really ought to prioritize?
Well, Donna, let me just say this, that the U.S. approach is to have a private nuclear industrial complex, to have private owners, private buyers. And a lot of the focus of our nuclear industrial capacity right now is looking at export markets, selling reactors in Poland or Romania or somewhere else, or China. The supply chain is sort of looking to fill that order book behind those sales of nuclear power plants. The one thing I see that could cause U.S. supply chain to get better is to have a fleet build exercise with a clear order of, 10 or more nuclear power plants in this country. You'd see a lot of companies putting a lot of effort into getting their supply chain stuff ready if they had real orders. Right now, it's somewhat hypothetical. There's a struggle for some of these companies to keep going. They're living on O&M activities. They're living on other kinds of industrial activities because there aren't many orders in place. So that's what I'd say there. Let me go to this question from Ben about not just electricity. I agree that there may be ways to use power from nuclear besides making electricity. I mean, one way is perhaps also electricity, but it's not. It's doing things like spinning reserve, doing load following. Those things are not so easy, especially if you're a private owner who wants to make money. But you can also use the heat to do district heating. You can do other things. I don't really want to go into detail on all the things you could do, but the primary economic approach for these plants is electricity generators. That's probably going to remain the case for a while. The market for heat is a much lower value market, in my view. Maybe that'll change if we totally get rid of burning anything to do anything, but we're not quite there yet. Let's see. I guess, Lane, your question about financial support for workforce development, I'm really not sure I have enough understanding of what you mean there to answer that question. And clearly, as I said before, we have a privately operated, privately owned nuclear industrial sector. That financial support would come if there were lots of orders and there were lots of activity. I guess I'm not quite sure how we financially support workforce development for a privately owned, privately managed nuclear industrial sector. It's a difficult thing for the U.S. government to do.
So
I have unmuted Lane if he wants to clarify.
Okay, sure.
Yeah, sorry, folks. Hey, everybody. Lane Krastik, assistant professor at Virginia Commonwealth University in Richmond, Virginia. I'm asking more in the context as we have a lot of jobs open right now in our advanced reactor sector. We have national labs losing employees to advanced reactor companies, vice versa. We are not graduating enough people at this point in time, it seems like, and it does. I personally believe there will not be enough funding from the federal government to support it, and this isn't a negative from the federal government. It's just there's a certain point the industry has to step in and find a way to help shore up the pipeline where it can. So the idea was more of, with a very large gap, if we start building several of these reactors, do we have enough funding to support workforce development at trade level, community college level, bachelor's level, and graduate level?
I'm not sure I have a strong answer to that question. I'm really not so sure, except to say that in an ideal world with a big order book of lots of reactors, the market, including people going to programs in school, would respond. And so what you're asking really is, how do we get that to happen before the orders are there? That's tough. Not quite sure that happens. So maybe we don't have enough financial support, if that's what you mean. So I'm going to move on to Ben again. Look, I I'm answering this question about NuScale. I've done some work with NuScale and some customers of NuScale. I don't quite understand how we get back into this. I mean, there are companies out there who have the capabilities and have agreed to become part of NuScale's supply chain because they're making strategic investments in the company. I think that's a very powerful strategy for NuScale. If there were a lot of NuScale orders in the U.S., maybe some U.S. companies might step up and become part of that. But the reality of the NuScale model is they're probably going to be exports as much as or more than U.S. orders. So having Doosan as who's a well-known, well-qualified international supplier in their supply chain is, first of all, a big confidence builder for customers because they want to make sure these things get built right. It's also, a way for NuScale to have a source of reactors before there's a dedicated factory built or instead of a dedicated factory being built. So I think it's a good thing. The U.S. role in this maybe, but it depends on having orders in the U.S. I think.
Edward, I think that takes us to the end of your time. I'm really appreciate you contributing today, and we look forward to continuing this discussion at 2:00. I'm sure that after the remainder of this day, there's going to be a lot more questions about how we put all this stuff together, and then we'll continue that discussion tomorrow in workshops. But look forward to seeing you again later on today.
Thank you, Donna. Thank you, Donna, and we'll see you guys later.
Okay, thank you.